5 common political myths. Not much need to repeat it, it's in the title already, but I think it felt weird to start without it. All of these myths are not outright lies, but instead misleading facts, ones that are technically factual, but not essentially truthful. Let's start off the list with number 1. In the US, there are 20 times more empty homes than homeless people.
I'm not calling on anybody to break the law. I'm just pointing out the fact that there are 600,000 homeless people in this country, 40,000 homeless veterans, and 1 in 5 homeless people are kids. Meanwhile, we have 28 empty homes for every homeless person. So I'm calling on all of us to think about the empty homes that are owned by corporations like BlackRock, like Zillow, like the banks, that are owned by those companies, those large corporations, and not being used for what they're intended for, which is actually housing people.
This is true only in the most literal sense of the myth, as in, if you Google how many empty homes there are, 16 million, and how many homeless people there are, 653,000, and divide these numbers, you'll get a number just over 20. But this is an extremely inaccurate number and implies a lot that is simply untrue. The reality is that there aren't enough vacant homes, not too many. That 16 million is an incredibly misleading number. This number comes from the Census Bureau's 2021 American Community Survey, and you can see that this number can be broken down into 3 main categories. 30% of the homes are ones that are trying to be sold or rented. Either it's on the market or it's just been rented and just not moved into already. Taking these houses and giving them to the homeless might seem like a good idea, but occupancy rates are directly correlated with housing prices, driving up the price of rent for everyone else. And something else that's directly correlated with housing prices? Homelessness. Essentially, ensuring that these houses are for homeless people provides the poor people who rent the inability to be flexible with market pressures and causes them to be priced out of their homes. There is another 37% of the vacant homes, and they are defined as being under foreclosure, being used for storage, needing maintenance, or abandoned. Something that's rarely talked about is that the houses that need maintenance or were abandoned are dilapidated houses from the early 20th century that are embroiled in mold, lead paint, asbestos, exposed wiring, and other hazardous materials. The best thing to do with these houses is to bulldoze them and build on top of the land. The remaining 33% of the vacant homes are vacation homes, ones that people own but only live in during the summer or winter season. Here is usually where the solutions split into 2 directions. Some might say that supply and demand dictate prices, and the increase in prices is tied to the fact that it's illegal to build dense homes in most of America. Legalize building homes and prices become affordable like they do in Houston or Japan, and then we can always tax the people who are rich enough to own vacation homes so much that the U.S. can give stipends to every American to make sure that everyone can pay for rent. Some others might say that we should instead seize the people who own vacation homes and create a cutthroat and violent civil war against the landlords. The first group might say that that sounds invasive, ineffective, and infeasible, but the second group might respond that it scores them moral points on the internet without having to deal with the complexity of the issues they ostensibly care about. So, it's impossible to say which group is right. Myth number 2. China abolished poverty.
I don't even think it should be that. It should just be which system is more effective at distributing resources and helping people have good outcomes.
And China has abolished poverty, and we have rampant poverty.
China hasn't abolished
Yes,
poverty.
they have, according to the World Bank.
There's 300,000 homeless people in China.
Though, in ratio.
He said they abolished poverty.
They did
There's
Google it. The
300,000
World
homeless
Bank wrote a
people.
full article on it. They
National
have
Center of
abolished
Biotechnology
relative poverty.
Information.
Now, people will generally cite this report from the World Bank, and this seems pretty legitimate. I mean, it doesn't say that China abolished poverty, that 800 million people were lifted out of poverty, but let's not quibble. If we check the World Bank's own stats, we see this remarkable decrease in impoverished people. And here's the US's for good measure. I hope everyone is squinting a little close at these images to figure out what the problem is here. And I'll give you a clue. Look at the y-axis. You see it? Here is the data that I reformatted to match China's axes. This becomes clear what exactly is happening if we look at the original report. Though the title of the World Bank report states that China lifted 800 million out of poverty, they're doing a bit of a shortcut here. If we read the report, it's not exactly poverty. It's extreme poverty. And extreme poverty is something around $2 a day for an entire household. It's a big deal that China was able to lower their extreme poverty rate from around 80% to almost 0. It's also a big deal that China had an extreme poverty rate of around 80% to begin with, well above most other developed countries' metrics. But what about normal poverty, or the way that most members of the US would know it? How is China doing there? Well, let's look at a higher number, $6.85. This is a day, mind you, not an hour. The US is at about 1% of their population. I don't mean to diminish this number. $6.85 a day is impossible for me to envision living off of. Poverty is a policy choice, and the fact that millions of Americans are living off of that concerns me. And I know that there are ways that we can decrease this number and make life better for everyone. But I want to call out this myth because it's important that we look at how the positions that we advocate for affect the outcomes. And if people want to advocate for China's policy positions, they need to actually look at the amount of people who fall under $6.85 a day. Because how much of China's population is living off of that meager income today is 25%. Myth number 3. A study showed that our opinions don't match the policies that get made into law.
This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left at 0% are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right at 100% are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal.
Once again, this is another highly misleading but technically correct statement. The study they're referring to is Cambridge University's study, Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens, which tests American policies that got enacted into law against American citizens' opinions about those policies. And what they found shocked everyone but the doomers online. There is absolutely no correlation. If an American cares about an issue, if it actually becomes a law is a coin flip. However, once you look at economic elites or interest groups, those numbers shoot up into something statistically significant. To quote the study itself, what do our findings say about democracy in America? They certainly constitute troubling news for advocates of populistic democracy, who want governments to respond primarily or exclusively to the policy preferences of their citizens. In the United States, our findings indicate the majority does not rule, at least not in the causal sense of actually determining policy outcomes. When a majority of citizens disagree with economic elites or with organized interests, they generally lose. Moreover, because of the strong status quo bias built into the US political system, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favor policy change, they generally do not get it. So, what about this is a myth? All of the previous myths have been misreadings of reports, but this seems to be pretty solidly saying that Americans' voices do not match policies. Well, 3 different papers were published a year after this one, showing that there were a lot of mistakes to the paper. There's a pretty thorough distillation of all of the problems that the original paper had in this Vox article, but I think the best argument is one of interest. The study compiled polls like the creation of an investment tax credit for corporations, a 1997 poll asking whether trade agreements should be subject to a simple up or down vote, and a 1991 poll on whether non-bank corporations like GE should be allowed to own banks. The average person can answer negatively or positively about how they feel about investment tax credits, but that won't represent the actual policy at the end of the day because they also don't really care about investment tax credits. As soon as you start factoring in interest from the average American person, that R squared gets a lot higher. And I'll give some examples in the next myth. Myth number 4. America doesn't spend anything on healthcare because we're too busy funding war.
The United States has spent trillions of dollars on war and military and the infrastructure around it. We can't afford universal health care. We can't afford to pay our teachers well for education. We can't afford to forgive student loan debt. We can't afford to provide free lunches for students. We can't afford to repair our roads and infrastructure and bridges. We can't afford a high-speed railroad system. We can't afford the Green New Deal. All of these things because all of our money goes to military.
Let me ask a question, and don't cheat and look it up. Let's ignore everything else the government spends on. Pretend there are only two buckets that we spend money on. The first bucket is military, defense, and border security. The second bucket is Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment insurance. How much would you say that we do spend on each bucket relative to each other as a percentage? Then answer how much we should spend on each bucket. Actually pause the video and write down your answer or say it out loud. I polled some people too and documented how they answered. I had a rigorous 5 sample size, so you know this is scientific. Here are the stats. The top row is how much everyone thinks we currently spend on each bucket, the military bucket being colored red and healthcare colored blue. Each of the 5 people can broadly be placed into far left, center, center right, and far right. They all had wildly different ideas of how much we spend, but notably, only one person's was correct. And it wasn't how much they thought it was how much that it should be. How much this center-left Americans' belief of how much we should spend on healthcare and military is exactly how much we actually do spend. It's around 85% on healthcare to 15% military. The reason people think otherwise, I believe, is mostly due to the proliferation of this image that makes it look like we spend about half of our budget on military. But this is discretionary spending, of which the entirety of Bucket 2 is not. If we look at the total budget, we can see that the blue and yellow sections are the healthcare bucket and the green is the military one. I think this is generally pretty interesting about how much the government is more in line with our wants than we think it is. For every person except the far right, they reshifted the numbers to how much the budget should be and got closer to how much that it actually is. It's also worth noting that after I gave the correct numbers, the far right person said that actually that's pretty close to how much we should be spending. I debated about including this one in with the rest of the myths because I agree a lot with this sentiment. I wish we were spending a lot more in healthcare. I think universal healthcare is a net positive and we should fight to have it. But even if we completely abolish the military and put all of that money into the second budget, our budget for our healthcare will only increase a small amount, not nearly enough for universal healthcare. If we don't understand the problem, we can't hope for a solution. And this is not the problem. Myth number 5. 60% of Americans cannot pay for a $400 emergency.
We know that 46% of all Americans would struggle coming up with $400 in the event of an emergency. And 60% of all Americans will face that emergency within 12 months or less.
Rising cost of living is making it harder for Americans to cover emergencies. A survey from Lending Club found Americans don't have enough money to cover a $400 emergency. $400 is the Federal Reserve's measurement for the financial well-being of U.S. households.
This one, I hope, should make you squint at it. 60% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. Look, I've been to a point in my life where I couldn't afford a $400 emergency. I've been broke and destitute before. But 60%? That is an insanely high number. So let's look at the original survey done by the Federal Reserve. The first thing to note here is that this is a check all that applies question. So if you take these 6 answers and add them up, you get 55% and you can round up to 60%. But if you add up the other 2 options, you would get 86% of Americans can afford an emergency. And that's reflected in the next question. Of course, this 14% of people is not what was reported in news articles. I also want to take a pause here and recognize why it's important to dial down on these myths. Bernie Sanders says it well in his rhetoric.
Me, as I think you know, education is a major, major priority. This is the richest country in the history of the world. There is no reason why we should not have the best public educational system on earth.
This is the richest country on earth. The issue isn't that almost everyone is poor. The issue is that almost everyone isn't. We have more people who are richer than anyone ever before in human history, and yet we still have poverty. That is a problem, but again, a problem can only be solved when we understand it, and we need to understand that everyone who can pay for emergencies, which is a sizable majority of the US population, can ensure that not a single American needs to. Myth number 6. Donald Trump's biggest campaign donor was the DNC. You might say, hey, this is absolutely not a common myth at all. In fact, you're not even going to show stats or graphs breaking this down. This is like self-evidently false. And you'd be right, because there was a secret theme to all these myths. Stupid shit that my philosophy professor feels like he's qualified to yap about. I've been in his class for like 6 weeks, and he said exactly 6 things about politics, and they have all been completely misleading. Also, if this video gets 5,000 likes, I will email this YouTube video to him and post his response. That might not be a big deal, right? I mean, I'm 28. I'm probably graduating soon anyway. Nope. I transferred schools twice, majors 4 times, and took a 5-year break. I'm a sophomore, baby, and my new declared major, philosophy. He will almost definitely be my professor again. And if you get this done before May 1st, 2024, I will certainly be in his class when he watches this. What's up, Dr. Hart? I hope you like and subscribe for more.